Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into a really powerful essay that honestly just flips the script on how we think about sex ed for autistic adolescents.
It really does.
It argues that mainstream research isn't just missing a few details. It's built on a foundation that's so flawed, it basically makes an entire population invisible.
And that's our mission today, really, to dig into this essay, which the author calls a cartography of absence.
A cartography of absence.
Ooh.
Wow.
Yeah, we're literally mapping the blind spots, all the spaces where even well-meaning research just fails to see autistic bodies, their ways of learning, and, their actual lives.
And the thing that grabbed me right away was this idea of a translation error,
Hmm.
that these studies approach sexuality as if it's just information to be conveyed, like a software update you push to someone.
Instead of language to be shared.
Exactly, an embodied thing.
Right.
So the failure isn't the data, it's the frame itself, the ontology, as the essay puts it.
And that word, ontology.
Yeah.
It sounds academic, but if we just break it down, it's really about the unspoken rules. The deep assumptions about who gets to pout, how they learn, and what kind of knowledge is even considered legitimate.
And if your rules say that only linear verbal learning is real,
Then everything else gets written off as a deficit. Simple as that.
Okay, so let's unpack that. The failure of the frame, it starts with the body, doesn't it? What's the core assumption that immediately excludes so many autistic people?
Well, the whole structure is built on this idea that knowledge is just conceptual content. It flows from an adult to a passive adolescent.
The empty vessel model.
Right. And that completely misses that. Autistic ways of knowing, especially for gestalt language processors, are so sensory. They're embodied. They're rhythmic.
Okay, hold on. Let's pause on that term. Gestalt language processing, GLP. For anyone listening, what's the quick version of what that means here?
Absolutely. So think of it this way. The typical learning model is analytic. You learn word by word, piece by piece, ABC. A gestalt learner, or a GLP learner, often get the whole chunk at once. They hear a phrase and absorb the entire emotional tone, the rhythm, the music of it first. They're reading the air, not just the words.
So safety isn't a definition you learn. It's a feeling, a signal you recognize.
Exactly. The tone, the pattern. And this takes us right to how research gets the autistic body so wrong, especially with something like alexithymia.
Yes, alexithymia, which is usually framed as
a deficit of comprehension. Like the person just doesn't feel or can't understand emotion, a kind of internal blankness.
But the essay argues that's completely wrong.
It's not an absence of feeling. It's a misfit, a mismatch between the feeling itself and the standard language we have for it. The sensation can be overwhelming, totally clear, like a fire alarm going off inside you.
The words don't fit.
The words just aren't there, or they don't map onto it. It's a communication disconnect, not a conceptual one. The failure is in the language we offer, not in the body feeling it.
That is a huge reframing. So if the body knows the truth long before the words arrive, what does that do to our whole idea of consent?
It means we have to start talking about sensory consent and about embodied literacy. And at the heart of that is interoception.
Interoception, that's our sense of what's happening inside our own bodies.
Exactly. Knowing you're hungry or anxious or overwhelmed. And for many autistic people, sensory overload can look like avoidance or disinterest. But really, it's just the body protecting itself.
Something the verbal first frameworks just completely miss.
They miss that touch can be literal, not symbolic. They miss that GRK learners are reading safety in someone's breath, in their posture. They often get consent on a pattern level way before you could teach them a script about it. They have this embodied ethical orientation.
Because they know what coercion feels like.
They've lived it.
So this erasure doesn't just stop with the individual. The essay argues it extends right into the family, which brings us to this idea of the neurotypical parent.
The framework just assumes the parent is straight, cisgender, neurotypical, and already fluent in the dominant script.
The ideal teacher.
Right. It literally can't imagine that the parent might also be autistic, or queer, or trans, or a gestalt learner themselves. The neurodivergent family, which is way more common than the research admits, is just erased.
So the curriculum isn't just failing the kid.
It's failing the parent who's supposed to teach it. The literature has no concept that an autistic household might already be teaching boundaries through patterns, through rhythm, through a sensory language that the neurotypical world thinks is impossible.
Which puts this huge burden of translation on autistic caregivers.
A massive burden. They have to take this foreign curriculum full of metaphors and euphemisms and rebuild it into something that makes sense in sensory reality, all with zero support.
The policy is basically designed to marginalize them.
By design.
Okay, so if the family is erased, the future often is too. Let's talk about the next blind spot, the missing queerness.
Yeah, and the author calls this one the limits of the researcher's imagination, which feels about right.
It's kind of staggering when you think about it.
It is. We know autistic youth are disproportionately queer. They question gender at much higher rates. And yet the research model assumes this one, single track. A straight line to dating, coupling, reproduction.
Can't even perceive the very population that needs these conversations the most.
It ignores gender diversity, trans experiences. It ignores that for so many queer autistic kids, their real education and their ethical grounding comes from each other, from their community, not from these formal systems.
And this brings up another point, a necessary one, the freedom not to couple.
Yes, the whole framework is built on compulsory sexuality. It assumes a relationship is the goal. But what about all the other ways of building a life?
What gets missed when that's the only path you can see?
So much. Asexuality for one, or, and this is crucial, queerplatonic relationships.
These are those really deep life partner bonds that aren't romantic or sexual.
Exactly, life-altering connections. But our language barely has a word for them. The research certainly doesn't. It also misses polyamory or communal living. You can't imagine that a life of, chosen solitude or non-sexual intimacy could be a healthy, desired outcome.
So the frameworks are just fundamentally broken. And that leads to this quote I keep coming back to. The research mistakes the edges of its own method for the edges of autistic possibility.
That's the methodological trap in a nutshell. They equate knowing with being able to say it in a certain way, with verbal analytic speech.
But for a GLP learner,
your knowledge is intuitive, it's relational. You can read the intent in a room instantly, but the test asks you to recite a script. The curriculum is talking to the verbal cortex, but you're listening with your whole body.
And this isn't just a methodological problem, is it? It connects directly to the missing politics, to the cultural fear around all of this.
It absolutely does. You've got two big forces. One is just neoliberal outsourcing,
Yeah.
the state basically washing its hands of sex ed and dumping it on families.
Leaving the most vulnerable with the least support.
Of course. But the second one is far more insidious. It's a deep cultural fear.
The fear of autistic desire.
Yes. It gets coded as dangerous as high risk. So the research becomes obsessed with surveillance and risk management, not with autonomy or agency.
The autistic body is seen as a problem to be managed.
A site of control. Yeah. It fuels this model that's all about control, not trust. The whole system is, as the essay says, just terrified of autistic agency.
So if that's the problem, what's the solution? Where does a better framework even begin?
It begins with embodiment. It begins by teaching sexuality as a form of literacy for your own body. So before any vocabulary, you teach interoception, how to notice your internal states without judgment.
So sensation becomes information.
Reliable information. And from there, you can build a model of sensory consent. Not just words. It's about mapping safe touch, overwhelming textures, soothing rhythms. It's a negotiation.
And the communication has to be.
GLP sensitive. Direct statements, clear patterns, no metaphors.
And obviously mandatory queer inclusivity.
Non-negotiable. That means recognizing non-binary bodies, validating queer platonic bonds, and honoring that non-reproductive futures are valid. It means talking about trans-specific knowledge like dysphoria. And finally, it means recognizing autistic parental expertise, valuing the knowledge that's already there.
Which brings us to the big takeaway, really, that teaching sexuality to autistic adolescents is not a matter of simplifying. It is a matter of translating into the language they already speak.
That's it. It's not about slowing down. It's about changing the language entirely.
It's about the worldview, not just the vocabulary.
Exactly. The institutions mistake silence for absence. They mistake difference for deficit.
Yeah.
This essay is so important because it's not just a critique, it's the map. It shows us exactly where the old maps failed.
So for you listening, what does this all mean? We've seen how these systemic assumptions can make people invisible. And this failure to recognize autistic embodiment is, at the end of the day, a failure to protect people.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
And it leaves us with a pretty big question to think about, I think. If we accept that the body speaks in signals long before the world gives us words for them, how could we rethink consent education for everyone, not just for autistic youth? How could we prioritize that kind of embodied listening over just, reciting a script?